Number 10. The James Dean Porsche Little Bastard. Some cursed objects are old enough to gather legends slowly, accumulating fear over generations until the story hardens around them like dust on a relic. Others arrive in public consciousness violently, almost instantly, because the tragedy attached to them is too visible to ignore. That is what makes James Dean's Porsche, nicknamed Little Bastard, so powerful at number 10. It was not an ancient artifact. It was modern, sleek, mechanical, and built for speed. Yet within a remarkably short time, it became one of the most famous allegedly cursed objects in American cultural history. Part of that power comes from timing. James Dean was already becoming a symbol of youth, intensity, danger, and doomed charisma. When he died in a car crash while driving the Porsche, the vehicle stopped being just a machine. It became fused with the mythology of a rising star cut down at the exact moment his image was taking hold. In ordinary circumstances, a wrecked car might remain evidence, scrap, or a sad footnote. But this was not ordinary. Fame magnified the object. The twisted metal became a vessel for grief and fascination. That would have been enough to give the car a haunting reputation. But what pushed it into cursed territory were the stories that followed. The wrecked Porsche was said to keep spreading misfortune through its parts, as though the fatal energy of the original crash had not ended with Dean's death. Components allegedly removed from the car were linked to later accidents. People who handled or displayed the remains became attached to further stories of injury, fire, damage, and disappearance. The vehicle no longer looked like the end point of a tragedy. It looked like the beginning of one. What makes such a case so compelling is that it exists on the border between material reality and myth-making. Cars are powerful symbols already. They promise freedom, status, youth, risk, and speed. When disaster strikes, especially involving a celebrity, the machine can begin absorbing meanings far beyond engineering. The Porsche was not just blamed for the crash. It began to seem like an active participant in a chain of destruction. Every later rumor deepened that impression. The object survived impact, dismantling, and public curiosity, but its survival itself started to feel wrong, as if the wreck refused to become inert. That is where the curse narrative becomes psychologically potent. Human beings struggle with meaningless death, especially when it feels premature and cinematic. A fatal crash involving James Dean was already the kind of event people wanted to interpret rather than simply accept. The car provided a focal point for that need. Instead of confronting chance, recklessness, speed, and fragile mortality, people could imagine a darker continuity. The danger did not end because it was never only in the driver. It had seeped into the object. And of course, once an item gains that reputation, every later event around it becomes charged. A normal mishap stops looking normal. A rumor gains emotional force because the audience is already prepared to believe the pattern. The Porsche becomes an engine not only of speed, but of narrative momentum. The more it moves through hands, headlines, and retellings, the more inevitable the curse begins to feel. Coincidence turns into evidence simply by repetition. What makes Little Bastard especially suitable for this list is that it embodies a distinctly modern form of cursed object fear. This is not a jewel from a royal treasury or an antique linked to some forgotten ritual. It is a machine from the modern world, tied to celebrity culture, media amplification, and post-war fascination with speed. Yet it attracted the same ancient structure of belief. Object plus death plus repeated misfortune equals something people no longer want to treat as neutral. In the end, the Porsche's legend reveals something deeply unsettling about cursed objects. They do not need to be ancient to feel contaminated. They only need to become the place where grief, fame, and repeated disaster appear to overlap too neatly. Whether Little Bastard carried a supernatural force or only a human hunger for pattern, the result was the same. The car no longer represented motion. It represented the disturbing idea that some tragedies do not stay where they happen. Number 9. The hands resist him, painting. Few objects become cursed as efficiently as a painting. A jewel may carry greed, a weapon may carry violence, but a painting carries presence. It watches while being watched. That is what makes the hands resist him so unnerving. Even before the curse stories attach themselves to it, the image already possessed the most important quality a cursed object can have. It felt wrong in a way that was difficult to explain cleanly. The painting itself is unsettling enough. A young boy stands beside a doll-like girl in front of a glass-panelled door. Behind that glass are shadowy hands pressing forward from darkness, as if something is trapped on the other side or trying to get in. The composition triggers discomfort immediately because it combines familiar elements with emotional distortion. Childhood innocence is present, but not safely. The doll appears human enough to be eerie and artificial enough to be threatening. The hands behind the glass suggest pressure, intrusion, and invisible witness. Nothing violent is explicitly happening, but the atmosphere implies that something has already gone wrong. That visual instability is what gave the object such extraordinary curse potential when it entered internet-era folklore. Stories began circulating that people felt ill after looking at the painting, that children were frightened by it, that figures in the image seemed to move, and that the work carried a disturbing energy. Once those claims spread, the painting stopped being just a strange artwork. It became an alleged carrier of psychological disturbance. People did not only dislike it, they approached it the way one approaches an infected thing. What makes this case especially fascinating is how perfectly it shows the relationship between image and belief. Many cursed objects depend on a chain of bad events occurring around them in the world. The hands resist him works differently. Its first impact is direct and mental. The object appears cursed because it already behaves like an intrusion into the viewer's emotional stability. Looking at it becomes part of the legend. The image does not need a long royal history or a trail of documented deaths to make people uneasy. It performs the unease immediately. And that matters because modern curse narratives often thrive not on aristocratic provenance but on reproducibility. A famous diamond must be physically possessed to spread its legend. A painting, especially in the digital age, can circulate endlessly through photographs, reposts, rumors, and reactions. Each viewer becomes part of the object's expanding field of reputation. The more people describe feeling disturbed, the more the next viewer arrives primed to experience the same thing. Fear multiplies through expectation. The curse becomes social as much as supernatural. Still, the painting's power cannot be dismissed as mere suggestion alone, because the artwork itself is genuinely effective. It is composed like a threshold scene. The boy and doll stand at the edge of some crossing the viewer cannot safely interpret. The hands behind the glass imply numbers, need, and trapped agency without explanation. Are they children, spirits, memories, threats? The image refuses to stabilize into one meaning, and that refusal is exactly what lets the curse story flourish. A cursed painting must feel like it is withholding a rule the viewer does not know. That is why the object became larger than a single work of art. It entered the cultural category of things people fear not because they have proven power, but because they seem to produce an immediate sense of contamination. To own it, display it, or even stare at it too long begins to feel like participation in something unwise. The painting becomes less like decor and more like an active threshold between ordinary experience and something less trustworthy. In the end, The Hands Resist Him belongs near the top of this list because it captures a distinctly modern form of cursed object dread. It is not ancient, jeweled, or ceremonially important. Its power lies in image, repetition, and atmosphere. It shows that an object can become feared not because it has already destroyed everyone around it, but because it makes enough people feel that destruction, or at least disturbance, may be waiting just beyond the frame. Number 8. The Koh-i-Noor diamond. Some objects seem cursed because they pass through too many tragedies to remain innocent. The Koh-i-Noor diamond fits that pattern almost perfectly. Long before it became one of the most famous jewels in the world, it had already moved through conquest, imperial struggle, theft, forced transfer, humiliation, and the collapse of dynasties. That is what gives its reputation such weight. The curse does not emerge from one dramatic accident. It emerges from the feeling that wherever the diamond goes, power becomes unstable and someone pays for possessing it. Part of the stone's dark aura comes from the simple fact that it was never an ordinary luxury object. The Koh-i-Noor was tied to kingship, empire, and legitimacy. To own it was not merely to own a beautiful gemstone, it was to make a claim about supremacy. That changes everything. Once an object becomes bound to rulership, every transfer of it starts looking less like inheritance and more like a visible record of victory and defeat. Bloodshed begins clinging to the gem not metaphorically, but historically. And that history is exactly what makes the curse story so persistent. The diamond moved through powerful courts and regimes, but it never seems to arrive in peace. It appears in stories of invasion, plunder, deposition, treaty pressure, imperial display, and contested sovereignty. Unlike a cursed painting or a haunted box, the Koh-i-Noor does not need whispers of supernatural movement. Its reputation is strengthened by documented political violence. The jewel survives, thrones do not. Empires change hands. The object remains brilliant while the human systems around it fracture. That is why the curse attached to it took such a specific form. The stone came to be associated not simply with bad luck, but with danger to male rulers or those who would wear it as a symbol of direct sovereign power. That detail matters because it shows how the legend tried to make sense of a repeated pattern. Too many men seem to seek authority through the jewel and find ruin instead. Over time, the explanation hardened. Perhaps the diamond itself resists possession, allowing only limited forms of ownership without consequence. Of course, skepticism has an obvious response. A diamond tied to empire will naturally be found near violence because empire itself is violent. Conquerors seize treasures, courts fall, rulers die, political objects accumulate catastrophe because they are placed at the center of catastrophe. But that rational explanation does not dissolve the unease. In some ways, it sharpens it. The Koh-i-Noor becomes cursed not necessarily because it contains supernatural force, but because it has become a perfect concentrate of greed, ambition, and imperial humiliation. The object is a mirror that repeatedly reflects the worst instincts of power. That is what makes it so unsettling as an artifact. A cursed object often feels contaminated by the emotions invested in it. With the Koh-i-Noor, those emotions are enormous. Desire, conquest, humiliation, prestige, vengeance, possession, national memory. The stone has been looked at not simply with admiration, but with hunger. And once a jewel gathers that much symbolic violence, it begins to feel less like a decoration and more like an active participant in human ruin. It becomes difficult to imagine anyone truly owning it, without also inheriting the conflicts wrapped around it. The diamond also survives in an especially provocative way because it remains visible while its meanings remain contested. It is still discussed not just as a gem, but as a wound. Questions of restitution, legitimacy, and historical theft continue to cling to it. That ongoing argument keeps the curse alive. The object is not locked safely in the past. It continues to radiate unfinished historical pressure in the present. In the end, the Koh-i-Noor belongs on this list because it represents one of the purest forms of disaster-bearing object mythology. Whether cursed supernaturally or not, it has travelled through history like a concentrated fragment of conquest itself. People do not fear it because it is ugly or grotesque. They fear it because it is beautiful enough to make powerful people destroy one another for the right to say it was theirs. Number 7. The unlucky mummy legend. Some cursed objects are feared because of what they are. Others are feared because of the story built around them. The so-called unlucky mummy belongs to the second category, and that is exactly why it became so effective. It was not even a full mummy in the way popular imagination often assumes, but an Egyptian funerary object whose reputation swelled until it felt like a portable disaster. That transformation is what makes the case so revealing. A museum piece became a curse legend powerful enough to infect everything around it with dread. Part of the legend's strength came from timing. The late 19th and early 20th centuries were full of Western fascination with Egypt, but that fascination often mixed scholarship with superstition, colonial entitlement, seance culture, sensational journalism, and a hunger for tales of ancient vengeance. In that atmosphere, an Egyptian artifact did not need much to become ominous. The object already came wrapped in death imagery, funerary symbolism, and the fantasy that disturbing the ancient dead might trigger retaliation. The cultural stage was prepared long before the specific curse story took shape. What made the unlucky mummy legend so durable was the way it attached misfortune not to a single dramatic event, but to a trail of claimed incidents. Illness, financial ruin, injury, accidents, and early death were said to follow those who acquired, transported, photographed, or even merely encountered the artifact. That cumulative structure is crucial to curse mythology. One bad event can be dismissed. A chain of them creates narrative gravity. Each retelling makes the object feel less like a museum piece and more like a hostile survivor of an older world. And because the object was linked to Egypt, every ordinary mishap could be absorbed into a much larger emotional script. Ancient tombs, sacred burials, forgotten rites, offended spirits, colonial theft, and the arrogance of modern possession all hovered around the story. The artifact became a stage on which modern people could reenact an old fear, the idea that the dead do not remain passive when the living take too much. That fear is older than archaeology itself, and the unlucky mummy legend gave it an especially memorable form. What makes the case fascinating is that the legend grew partly through institutions that are supposed to stabilize truth. Museums catalogue, preserve, and explain. Yet even within that world, rumors can accumulate around an object until official setting only intensifies the eeriness. Glass cases, labels, and archival care do not destroy the curse. They can actually sharpen it by creating contrast. Here is a rational institution displaying something many people privately suspect is not rationally safe. The object becomes doubly charged, legitimate enough to be curated, uncanny enough to be feared. There is also something uniquely powerful about mummy-related curse lore because it weaponizes burial against curiosity. Modern collectors and viewers want access, interpretation, possession, and display. The curse story answers that desire with a warning. Some things belong to the dead. Some boundaries were not meant to be crossed. And if they are crossed, the consequences may not look like lightning bolts or obvious miracles. They may look like slow, plausible, deniable ruin. That subtlety makes the legend harder to shake. Almost any bad outcome can be made to fit. Of course, from a skeptical perspective, the unlucky mummy legend shows exactly how myth attaches itself to famous objects. Once a story is in circulation, people begin noticing every death, delay, accident, and coincidence around it. Selective memory does the rest. Yet this explanation, while convincing, does not fully weaken the artifact's eerie status. It actually reveals something darker. Human beings are capable of giving an object so much narrative pressure that it begins functioning like a curse whether or not one exists. Fear becomes one of the object's real historical effects. In the end, the unlucky mummy belongs on this list because it captures the perfect union of artifact, empire, death, rumor, and modern media amplification. It may not prove the supernatural, but it proves something nearly as unsettling, that under the right conditions, a funerary object can become a machine for misfortune stories so strong that even careful institutions cannot fully strip away its aura of threat. Number 6. The Delhi Purple Sapphire, some cursed objects earn their reputation through fame, others do it through a far stranger path, moving quietly from owner to owner while leaving behind just enough damage to make the pattern hard to ignore. The Delhi Purple Sapphire belongs to that second category. It is one of the most intriguing examples of an allegedly cursed gemstone because even its identity carries confusion. Despite the name, it is not truly a sapphire at all, but an amethyst. That mismatch only adds to the unease. The object seems deceptive from the beginning, as though misfortune starts with false appearance. What gives the stone its dark reputation is the claim that it brought ruin, illness, financial loss, and misery to those who possessed it after being taken from India during the upheavals of empire. That detail matters because, like so many disaster-linked objects, the gem's curse story is tied not only to bad luck but to extraction. It is said to have been removed from a sacred or protected context during a violent historical moment, and from there the troubles began. The object becomes unsettling, not simply because people suffered around it, but because those sufferings seem to express a deeper moral logic. Something was taken that should not have been taken. That structure appears again and again in cursed object history. The curse punishes possession. It punishes the belief that beauty or rarity automatically grants the right to own. In the case of the Delhi Purple Sapphire, that idea becomes especially strong because the gem did not carry the overwhelming royal grandeur of the Koh-i-Noor. It was smaller, more intimate, less globally famous, and therefore in some ways more disturbing. A catastrophe-bearing diamond can feel mythic. A smaller stone that quietly ruins lives feels personal. What pushed the reputation further was the way later custodians reportedly tried to contain or neutralize it. Protective boxes, written warnings, ritual handling, or careful instructions all signal the same thing. People around the object stopped behaving as though it were an ordinary jewel, and that behavioral change is important. Once owners begin treating an artifact with ceremonial caution, the curse enters material history. The object is no longer merely said to be dangerous, it is being managed as dangerous. That is where the Delhi Purple Sapphire becomes so psychologically powerful. A cursed object does not need universal belief to function. It only needs enough doubt to alter behavior. If one owner suffers a string of losses, that may be coincidence. If the next owner has heard the story and still experiences trouble, the narrative tightens. Soon the object is surrounded by precautions, warnings, and curated fear. The gem becomes a center of attention, not because it shines, but because it appears to resist safe possession. Of course, the rational explanation is obvious enough. A stone with a dramatic backstory invites selective memory. Once people expect trouble, every illness, setback, quarrel, or financial reversal seems newly significant. But what makes the Delhi Purple Sapphire harder to dismiss emotionally is that its story rests on a deeper historical anxiety. Empire took vast numbers of objects under conditions that were anything but morally clean. A gem said to retaliate against its owners feels like a fantasy of historical revenge compressed into mineral form. The curse becomes a way of imagining that stolen beauty does not stay passive forever. That is why the object fits so perfectly into this video. It links disaster not just to the thing itself, but to the act of acquisition. The stone appears to ask a question more disturbing than simple supernatural fear. Not, is it cursed, but what did possession cost from the beginning? Once that question enters the story, every later accident starts feeling less like random misfortune and more like unpaid debt. In the end, the Delhi Purple Sapphire remains compelling because it is small enough to be held, but heavy enough to carry a whole structure of fear. Colonial theft, sacred violation, repeated misfortune, and the suspicion that some objects do not forgive being turned into trophies. Whether supernatural or not, it survived as a warning that not everything beautiful becomes harmless when placed in a collector's hand. Number 5. The crying boy, paintings, panic. Some cursed objects are feared because they seem unique. The crying boy painting's panic is far stranger because it attached disaster to something mass-produced. That is what makes it so revealing. This was not an ancient relic, a royal jewel, or a singular haunted artwork known only to collectors. It was a widely distributed image hanging in ordinary homes, and yet for a period of time it became the center of one of the most famous modern object panics, as people began asking why these sad-eyed portraits of children seemed to keep surviving fires that destroyed everything around them. That detail is the engine of the whole legend. Houses burned, furniture was ruined, rooms were blackened, and then, according to the stories, the crying boy print would still be found hanging there, scorched around the edges perhaps, but intact enough to look unnervingly untouched. Whether each account was fully accurate mattered less than the repetition of the image. Once enough people heard the same pattern, the paintings stopped feeling decorative. They started feeling like survivors in the wrong way. And that is exactly where modern curse psychology becomes powerful. Fire is one of the most terrifying household disasters because it erases control so quickly. It destroys not only possessions but safety itself. To imagine one object repeatedly enduring while the rest of domestic life collapses is to turn that object into a kind of witness, or worse, an accomplice. The print no longer appears lucky. It appears selective. That distinction is crucial. People were not simply impressed that it survived. They were unnerved that it survived while everything else did not. What makes the case even stronger is the emotional content of the image itself. A crying child is already a potent symbol. Sadness, innocence, accusation, vulnerability, and discomfort all sit inside the face. Such an image hanging in a damaged house becomes instantly loaded with meaning. The child seems to have seen something. The expression begins to look less sentimental and more ominous. In other words, the image was perfectly built to receive fear once the fire stories began circulating. The mass-market nature of the prints only intensified the panic. Because they were common, people could easily imagine the curse close to home. This was not a distant museum problem or an aristocratic jewel locked in a vault. It could already be hanging in a neighbor's living room, or your grandmother's hallway, or above someone's television. The ordinary accessibility of the object made the legend democratic in the worst possible sense. Disaster-linked fear entered the domestic sphere. Media amplification, of course, played a huge role. Once newspapers, television, and local rumor networks started repeating the association between crying boy prints and house fires, each new incident came pre-framed as possible evidence. People threw the prints away, some destroyed them deliberately, others avoided them altogether. And in doing so, they turned the object into a cultural event. The curse no longer lived only in the painting, it lived in the social response surrounding it. A skeptic can explain much of this. Cheap framed prints may have survived fires because of the materials used, the position where they hung, the way cords failed, or the fact that they fell face down and were partially protected. The human mind, already primed by rumor, did the rest. But that explanation still leaves something important untouched. The crying boy panic shows how easily an ordinary object can become saturated with dread once repeated survival begins to look intentional. The image did not need to cause the fires, it only needed to remain present after them. In the end, the crying boy paintings belong at number 5 because they reveal one of the darkest modern truths about cursed objects. Mass reproduction does not weaken the aura of fear. Under the right conditions, it multiplies it. A single haunted portrait is unnerving. Thousands of them hanging in ordinary homes while stories of fire spread around them become something worse. A panic in which the object seems to have escaped uniqueness and entered everyday life. Number 4. The Busby Stoop Chair. Some cursed objects become frightening because they are rare, hidden, or visually disturbing. The Busby Stoop Chair is different. It is frightening because it is so ordinary. A chair is one of the simplest objects in human life. It invites rest. It offers support. It belongs in kitchens, inns, homes, and taverns. That is exactly why this case is so unsettling. Once a chair acquires a reputation for death, the everyday world itself begins to feel less trustworthy. The legend surrounding the Busby Stoop Chair centers on a curse said to have been pronounced by Thomas Busby before his execution in 18th century England. According to the story, anyone who sat in his favoured chair afterward would meet disaster, often in the form of sudden death. Over time, the chair's reputation grew as story after story attached itself to it. Soldiers, workers, drinkers, visitors, and skeptics were all said to have sat in it only to die not long afterward. Whether every case was documented cleanly mattered less than the accumulation of the pattern. The chair stopped being furniture. It became a test of arrogance. What gives this object such power is the intimacy of the action required. A cursed jewel must be owned. A painting must be hung. A car must be driven. But a chair demands something smaller and more innocent. You simply sit down. That makes the alleged curse feel far more invasive. There is no grand act of greed or conquest involved. There is only a moment of ordinary human behavior followed, if the legend is to be believed, by fatal consequence. The simplicity of that structure is what makes it so memorable. The punishment seems wildly disproportionate to the act, and because chairs are bodily objects, the case feels personal in a way many cursed artifacts do not. To sit is to trust. You give your weight to the object. You lower yourself into dependence on it. That creates an unusually direct relationship between human vulnerability and material form. If the chair is cursed, then the body enters the curse immediately. No distance remains. The person is not merely near the object. The person is physically committed to it. That is why the legend became so durable in public imagination. The Busby Stoop Chair functions almost like a moral trap built into the everyday world. Skeptics are tempted to challenge it because the claim seems absurd. Believers avoid it because the risk feels unreasonably high. And every new retelling strengthens the social ritual around the object. It is pointed at, warned about, elevated out of reach, and treated with theatrical caution. In other words, the curse changes behavior whether one fully believes it or not. There is also something distinctly English and historically textured about the setting that helped the story endure. A roadside inn, a condemned man, a final curse, and a piece of familiar furniture all belong to a world where folklore and ordinary life overlap easily. The chair does not need Gothic grandeur. Its power comes from being embedded in a setting where stories travel through local memory, drinking culture, rumour, and repeated challenge. The object becomes a stage where skepticism and superstition keep meeting each other. Of course, rationally speaking, the legend is easy to question. A famous cursed chair attracts exactly the kind of selective memory that keeps object myths alive. Anyone who sat in it and lived quietly would not make the story stronger. Anyone who later suffered an accident, illness, or violent death would be folded into the legend immediately. The pattern would build itself through retelling. Yet even that explanation cannot entirely dissolve the object's eerie force, because the chair's real historical power lies in what it makes people do. It persuades them to treat an ordinary object as though contact itself were a gamble. In the end, the Busby Stoop Chair belongs this high on the list because it captures one of the darkest possibilities in cursed object lore. That danger does not need to be hidden in treasures, relics, or occult artifacts. It can settle into something as mundane as a seat in a room and make people fear the smallest act of trust. Once that happens, the curse has already succeeded, whether it is supernatural or not. Number 3. The Dybbuk Box. Some cursed objects inherit their menace from centuries of royal violence or repeated tragedy. The Dybbuk Box rose to fame in a far more modern way, yet it quickly became one of the most recognizable, allegedly haunted objects in popular culture. That is what makes it so fascinating. It combines old religious fear with contemporary storytelling, giving the impression of something ancient, portable, and spiritually contaminated moving through the modern world without losing any of its power. The object itself is not visually overwhelming. It is a box, a container, something meant to hold and conceal. That alone gives it immediate symbolic strength. Boxes are intimate objects. They keep private things private. They promise that something important, dangerous, or sacred may be sealed inside. A cursed box intensifies that logic to its limit. It suggests that what is inside is not merely valuable but active, and that opening or possessing the object could release consequences beyond the owner's control. What gave the Dybbuk Box its reputation was the claim that it was linked to a malicious spirit from Jewish folklore, a restless and harmful presence capable of attaching itself to the living. Whether the specific story around the box was historically solid is exactly the point of tension. The object rose through accounts of nightmares, illness, oppressive sensations, strange experiences, and mounting fear among those who owned or handled it. As the story spread, the box stopped functioning as an antique curiosity and began functioning as a narrative trap. Everyone who encountered it became a potential witness to the curse. That is where the object's power becomes especially modern. Unlike an old royal jewel whose story relies on dynasties and state violence, the Dybbuk Box entered public awareness through resale, anecdote, media retelling, paranormal fascination, and eventually wider pop cultural exposure. Its curse grew in an era when haunted object stories could spread rapidly and reach audiences already primed by horror conventions, internet circulation, and reality-based supernatural entertainment. The box did not need centuries of elite provenance. It only needed a believable enough chain of fear. Still, the spiritual structure of the story is much older than the media environment that amplified it. A sealed container linked to an unclean or hostile presence touches something very deep in human imagination. We understand instinctively why one should not open what has been shut away for a reason. We understand why some things, once disturbed, seem capable of crossing a boundary that should have remained intact. That is why the Dybbuk Box feels more dangerous than many other allegedly cursed antiques. It is not merely said to bring bad luck. It is said to hold something. That distinction matters enormously. A cursed ring may carry misfortune symbolically. A haunted box implies occupation. The threat becomes personal and immediate. Owners begin reporting not just accidents, but intrusion, disturbed sleep, oppressive atmosphere, unshakable dread, physical symptoms, and the feeling that the object is not passive in the room. Whether these reports reflect suggestion, stress, belief, or something else entirely, they create exactly the emotional environment a cursed object needs in order to thrive. The box becomes a center of escalating interpretation. And because it is a box, people project into it with unusual intensity. What is inside? Was it ever really sealed for protection? Is possession itself enough to trigger harm? Or must it be opened? Can it be contained again once disturbed? These questions keep the legend alive because the object resists closure. Even when locked away, donated, sold, or displayed, it still seems like a problem deferred rather than solved. A cursed painting can be turned to the wall. A cursed chair can be avoided. A cursed box always raises the suspicion that avoidance may not be enough. In the end, the Dybbuk Box belongs near the top of this list because it captures the most primal form of cursed object fear. Not simply that disaster follows the object, but that the object may be carrying an active presence from one life into another. Whether supernatural, psychological, or culturally amplified, the result is the same. The box does not feel like something people own. It feels like something they briefly, and perhaps unwisely, agree to keep near them. Number 2. The Bassano violins. Some cursed objects are feared because they look sinister. Others are feared because they remain beautiful while disaster gathers around them. That is what makes the Bassano violins so haunting. A violin should represent discipline, elegance, and the strange miracle of turning wood and strings into human emotion. It is an object built for resonance. And once an instrument like that acquires a reputation for repeated death or misfortune among its owners, the effect is uniquely disturbing. It feels as though beauty itself has become contaminated. The legend attached to the Bassano violins draws strength from repetition. One instrument linked to tragedy can be explained away. Several instruments associated with a chain of deaths, accidents, or abrupt misfortune begin to feel different. The story suggests not one unlucky ownership, but a family of objects moving through hands and leaving damage behind. That collective pattern matters because it transforms the violins from isolated curiosities into a kind of cursed lineage. The instruments stop feeling like possessions and start feeling like inheritors of doom. What gives the story such emotional force is the nature of musical instruments themselves. A violin is not like a jewel locked in a case or a painting observed from across a room. It must be held close to the body. It rests under the chin. It vibrates against bone. The player breathes with it, sweats with it, presses feeling into it. Few objects create such an intimate relationship between person and thing. If an instrument is believed to be cursed, then every performance becomes more than performance. It becomes contact. That intimacy is what makes the Bassano legend so psychologically rich. A great instrument often already carries a mystique before any curse story appears. Musicians speak of tone as though it had personality. Certain violins are said to open, resist, respond, or reveal themselves only to the right player. Once tragedy enters that world, the line between artistry and haunting becomes dangerously thin. The instrument does not merely sound beautiful. It begins to seem as though it takes something from the person who draws that beauty out of it. And because the violin is an object of inheritance, loan, sale, and prestige, it moves through generations in ways perfectly suited to curse mythology. Each new owner receives not just wood and craftsmanship, but the entire pressure of what happened before. Did the previous player die too young, lose everything, fall into illness, suffer breakdown? Even when such outcomes are unrelated, they do not stay unrelated once the story hardens. The next owner begins playing inside the shadow of all earlier owners. The instrument arrives already burdened. There is also something especially eerie about the idea of a cursed violin, because music itself feels immaterial and almost supernatural. Sound fills a room, disappears, and yet leaves emotional damage or beauty behind. A violin linked to misfortune seems like the perfect vessel for that ambiguity. It is delicate, portable, and expressive, yet capable of holding a myth far heavier than its frame. Unlike a chair or a car, it does not simply function, it sings. That makes it easier for people to imagine that some hidden force has found an unusually intimate way to speak through it. Of course, a skeptic would point out that rare instruments naturally accumulate dramatic biographies. They pass through talented, intense, ambitious people whose lives are already vulnerable to pressure, illness, competition, and obsessive devotion. Tragedy clusters around artists often enough without supernatural help. But that explanation does not erase the unease. In some ways, it intensifies it. A violin that repeatedly outlives its players begins to feel less like a tool and more like a witness, one that remains polished and resonant while the humans around it fail. In the end, the Bassano violins belong this high on the list because they embody one of the darkest forms of cursed object fear. The suspicion that an object can remain exquisite while consuming the lives that make it meaningful. They suggest that disaster does not always arrive through ugliness, violence, or obvious dread. Sometimes it arrives through something almost unbearably beautiful, held just beneath the chin, singing as if nothing were wrong. Number 1. The Hope Diamond. Some objects become cursed because rumor grows around them. The Hope Diamond feels different because its reputation is almost too perfectly built for disaster mythology. It is beautiful enough to inspire obsession, famous enough to absorb every story told about it, and historically entangled enough with wealth, violence, loss, and social collapse that the curse almost seems inevitable. That is why it stands at number 1. Few objects in history have done more to fuse glamour with dread. The first source of its power is obvious. The diamond is extraordinary. Its deep blue color and immense fame make it feel less like jewelry and more like a concentrated piece of myth. Objects on that scale do not remain neutral. They attract fantasy, theft, desire, envy, and projection. People do not simply admire them. They build stories around them because no ordinary explanation seems sufficient for why one object should possess so much value. The moment an object becomes too magnificent, people begin searching for the hidden cost. And the Hope Diamond offered plenty of material for that search. Across time, it became linked in public imagination with a sequence of misfortunes involving owners, handlers, or those connected to it. Financial ruin, scandal, broken lives, violent ends, personal suffering. Whether every tale was strictly accurate mattered less than the overall effect. The diamond seemed to move through privilege without granting safety. In fact, the very people most able to possess it often looked most vulnerable to the ruin surrounding it. That is exactly the kind of pattern curse legends need. What makes the Hope Diamond especially potent is that it sits at the crossroads of several kinds of fear at once. It is a gemstone, which means it is already tied to greed and possession. It is a famous artifact, which means it is tied to public scrutiny and embellishment. And it is associated with older stories of sacred theft, colonial extraction, and bad fortune befalling those who took what should not have been taken. Whether these stories are historically precise is almost secondary. They provide moral architecture. The curse becomes a punishment for appetite. That moral structure is why the diamond's legend survived so well. Human beings are deeply unsettled by the possibility that beauty may demand payment. A cursed diamond embodies that fear perfectly. It promises status, admiration, and the illusion of invulnerability. Then it reverses the promise. The richer or more powerful the owner, the more satisfying the collapse appears. The object becomes a judge of desire. It lets people imagine that greed, vanity, and the arrogance of ownership might eventually be punished by the very thing they prized most. And unlike some cursed objects, the Hope Diamond never needed to become grotesque in order to frighten. It remains dazzling. That is crucial. A hideous artifact can be avoided. A beautiful one creates conflict. People still want it. They still want to touch it, display it, claim it, and stand near its legend. That tension between attraction and danger is the essence of great cursed object mythology. The object does not repel. It tempts. Disaster enters through fascination. There is also a media dimension to the Hope Diamond that made it nearly unbeatable as a mythic object. Its fame ensured that every new owner, display, or public mention refreshed the aura around it. Newspapers, society gossip, museum attention, and popular retelling all helped preserve the sense that this was no ordinary stone. Once a diamond reaches that level of celebrity, it begins to exist in two forms at once: the physical gem itself and the expanding story field around it. By that point, even skepticism becomes part of the legend, because arguing against the curse still keeps the curse alive. A rational reading is easy to construct. Wealthy owners face risks, scandals, illnesses, and social downfall all the time. Famous objects attract exaggerated storytelling. Historical details become distorted because people prefer moral drama to messy reality. All of that is true. But the Hope Diamond still resists reduction because it has become something more than a misunderstood jewel. It is one of the clearest examples of an object absorbing the violence, desire, and instability of everyone who wanted it too badly. That is why it belongs at number 1. The Hope Diamond represents the ultimate disaster-bearing object, not because it proves the supernatural, but because it perfects the emotional mechanics of the curse. It is magnificent, desired, contested, and surrounded by enough tragedy to make innocence feel impossible. The stone survives untouched. Human beings circle around it, seeking status or ownership, and history keeps producing the same dark suggestion. Whatever brilliance the diamond offers, it never seems to give it away for free.